Hey y'all, it's Heel Heat time.
Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles and this is another episode of It Came From the Network, where we review the weird, the wacky, the wild, and sometimes the downright bad or pretty campy things that have happened in the history of wrestling. All that can be found on the WWE Network for the low, low price of $9.99 a month. There's your plug, Triple H. I expect a check in the mail, or at least a free subscription. Anyway, on this episode, we're going to review World Class Championship Wrestling, episode 65. Now, the reason I chose this episode is there's a limited amount of episodes, first off, that they have up of World Class Championship Wrestling. This one, to me, kind of encapsulated what made World Class Championship Wrestling special back in the early to mid 80s, while also bringing in some of the 80s style of wrestlers that we've seen prevalent in World Class, in Memphis, in the WWE, and all over the wrestling world during that era. Well, now that we've given you the preface, we're going to jump right in. First match of the night, Jimmy Garvin with Sunshine versus Jose Lothario. And if you think that name sounds familiar, you're 100% correct. That is Shawn Michaels' trainer, formerly a wrestler. Even at this point, he was towards the end of his career. Jimmy Garvin had a great match with Lothario. He wrestled it like an old school heel should, where he let Lothario take most of the offense, he backed off. He would have to resort to cheating to get the upper hand, and eventually when he rolled him up, he would hold the ropes where the ref couldn't see him and get the win. Just a fabulous display of how a heel should be a heel, and instead of trying to look like a badass heel or trying to be too cool for school heel where you're a bad guy but you get cheered anyway because you use insider terms and a little bit of shooting in your interviews. This is what a heel used to be. Used to be a guy that was just, you knew the face should have beat him, but he found a way to cheat a win out. Which was a great testament to Jimmy Garvin and how good he was, and Jose Lothario and how good of a face he was, and how much that area and that Texas crowd loved him for all that he had done leading up to this. Next up, we see a very dated interview with Skandar Akbar and King Kong Bundy, where we find out that Akbar is being funded by oil wells in the Middle East. Kind of weird and ironic that was even on the minds way back then, which if you remember, if you were alive during the early 80s, there was an oil crisis, an oil shortage, and this kind of played into it. Akbar talked about Bundy, he talked about bringing in Kamala, and he talked about the Great Kabuki, who were all part of Devastation Incorporated at the time, which if you're not familiar with, one of the great heel stables, not necessarily a faction, but more of a stable where guys would come in and out. He basically would bring in monsters to go up against the faces at the time. Just a great way that they would bring in stars and introduce stars and bring in these guys like Bundy, like Kamala, like later on guys like the One Man Gang and Cactus Jack, and all the way down and up and down the roster of great talents that would come in and would give awesome matches with the faces. We come off and we see Tola Yatsu, who's managed by Arman Hussein, who at the time was feuding with Akbar and the Devastation Incorporated, Hussein's group. And Hussein, it's kind of weird because Hussein had, up until this point and through this point, was a heel manager with heel wrestlers, so it was kind of a heel versus heel match where Tola Yatsu versus King Kong Bundy, and Bundy almost took the face role to the point where at the end of the match Bundy has control of it Hussein throws a kendo stick to Yatsu, who uses it and gets disqualified, so Bundy wins. All setting up a future match that would happen later on between Toru Yatsu and the great Kabuki kendo stick match, which just was pretty cool from them to go to the promo and then go right into the ring and show us what Bundy could do. A young, agile Bundy who wasn't quite as big as he would be, but still a very imposing figure. Probably at one of the peaks of his athletic ability. Just a great heel, kind of played a face role in the match. It was kind of a cool match to watch. Got to see a little bit of the nefarious, evil villains from other countries. Hussein is American but Muslim, which made him a heel at the time. Kind of weird and funny how that works out back then, and could even now to this day. We've seen recently in the past, the recent example would be guys like Muhammad Hassan and Davari, who kind of played the same role of a heel Muslim American. A little bit of a twist on the evil foreigner role, which we got a promo video for next with Kamala coming out of the great African wilderness, which actually was Jerry Jarrett's backyard. It was Jerry Jarrett or Jerry Lawler, I forget which one, but it was one of their two backyards were backed up against the woods, so they used that, used the smoke, put some African drumming behind. This is the promo video that would go around to all the territories when Kamala would debut, and basically explain he's a 6'9", 400-pound savage monster, and he's coming to your territory to take over. Akbar, in this case, was bringing him into this territory. Everywhere he would go, he would be paired with one of the top managers in that territory who would assign a handler, either a guy named Friday, which would be wearing a mask, or Kimchi later on, who also wore a mask. Awesome video. Cheesiness at its best. 80s promo style at its best. This is how they used to introduce guys, and this would be what would get you hyped. They would play these promos for weeks and sometimes months on end and get you ready for a guy that would come in and would run through the face roster before meeting the big face, and then in a big blow-off match, which would end his run or put him back down the card, and then he would go to a different territory, do the same thing there, and just circle around and keep doing that for years on end during the territory times. Just a great example. Like I said, this is a great time capsule of the early 80s. I believe this episode's from 83. Just before Vince McMahon takes wrestling global and worldwide with one company, we still had the territories in effect. And at this time, I believe World Class Championship Wrestling had more of a worldwide presence than WWE had. So this was more of the global entity that even the WWE was. Which is amazing to think about, that someone had a bigger global impact than Vince McMahon did at one point. But they did. And they had a bigger share, and they arguably had the better wrestlers and the better talent, which a lot would get rated later on, as you've seen with Kamala and King Kong Bundy leaving to go to the WWF. Also, some of the guys we're about to talk about now. The main event of the night, Kevin and Kerry Von Erich versus Terry Bam Bam Gordy and Michael P.S. Hayes. Yes, friends, it's the Von Erichs versus the Freebirds, the most historic feud in world-class championship wrestling history. One of the most historic feuds in wrestling history. This time in a 2-on-2 tag team, get this for irony, Texas Tornado match. Which, if you're familiar, that means there's no tags, all four guys are in the ring at the same time. Funny that they would use that kind of match, and I didn't know this going in that it was going to be that. with Kerry Von Erich, who would eventually become the Texas Tornado in the WWF. We see great brawling between the two teams, which eventually breaks down when David Von Erich and Buddy Roberts come in and get involved as well. Kind of what I expected from the two. You keep the heels looking strong, you keep the faces looking strong. That way you can lead to the big Dallas Stadium shows that they would produce. However, again, just another example of what made World Class so great. The Von Erichs and the Freebird feud, them brawling all over, them ending up in a double disqualification. That way they can continue to build the brawl. We see some of what made that such a great feud, and some of the heat that the Freebirds got in that time, and how over Kevin and Kerry and the rest of the Von Erichs were in that time frame, and probably still to this day in the Texas area, how over these two amazing, historically great factions and teams were. And just an overview, just a great, like I said, great time capsule. We had some of the heroes and some of the legends of World Class: Jimmy Garvin, King Kong Bundy, Skandar Akbar, Kamala, the Von Erichs, the Freebirds. I mean, you really couldn't ask more for what it essentially is a 45-minute show. You get a lot of the history of World Class Championship Wrestling in one neat little package that you can show to people and say, this is what World Class Championship Wrestling was about. Just some great stuff, some, like I said, a little bit of campiness with Kamala, the Akbar and Bundy stuff, but just a great example of a great promotion that probably should have kept on going. Unfortunately, the tragedies that would happen eventually drove the fans away, and eventually the company had to close. Sorry to go into such a down note there, but it's a great show, and we're going to go right into our ratings for this episode. Now, if you've seen our show before, or even if you haven't, we have a 1 to 5 scale. 1 being the worst, 5 being the best. 1's a gobbledygooker, 2's a renegade, 3's a Hurricane Helms, 4's a Gold Dust, 5 is King. I'm going to give the show a 4, a Gold Dust, a really solid show, some great wrestling action, some great examples of what a heel was at the time, some great examples of a little bit of the campiness and the production style of the 1980s, and what the territory days used to be like, and also a fabulous example of what World Class Championship Wrestling was and how great and special of a company that was. But basically, that's all I have to say about that. My name is George Coles, and this has been another episode of It Came From the Network.